So, Pascal, I mean, you used to be the European Commissioner for Trade as well. I mean, you know that recently China and the EU, I mean, last year, at the end of last year, China and the EU have signed this comprehensive investment treaty between the two parties. And somehow, you know, this has been slowed down again. But actually, the European business is still very bullish in China. We have seen the numbers, surveys coming from EU Chamber of Commerce. We see actually European investment in China is increasing. We see that all the auto sector or maybe pharmaceutical sector or even in aerospace, they do more business in China than their own countries now. So what do you see the prospect of a China-EU business? I mean, that is really great. Also, another question I want to pose to you is you are the president of Paris Peace Forum, and the Paris Peace Forum is really a great multilateral global governance platform, and now you have been spending a lot of efforts on that. But I see you actually leading a lot of discussion with WTO Direct General, WHO Direct General, quite a few rounds on that already. So what do you think about the Paris Peace Forum can promote the future globalization, in those areas? Pascal, please.
I'll answer these questions. Let me come back 1 minute to the point you made about China as a different system.
Okay.
And to say that I agree with that. I agree that those who thought 20 years ago that China would converge with the dominant system in the world, at least economically, let's leave aside the political regime, were not right. So the name of the game is not about convergence anymore, it's about coexistence. This is what we have to do. We have to better organize the coexistence of a specific China with the rest of the system. It's not about regime change. It's not about the rest of the world telling China, change your doctrine, shrink your state-owned sector, because a state-owned sector is not good for China, which personally I believe, but that's for the Chinese to decide. So whatever decision the Chinese leadership and people take on how they organize their economy, this is their business. But once the Chinese sovereignly decide they want to have 30% of their economy under state control because these companies have to be supported by the state, then you need to accept that others do not proceed the same way and that there has to be disciplines on state aid. So again, it's not about telling China how it should run this business. Once China decides it has a massive part of its economy under party and state control, this is a competitive disadvantage for others, which needs to be fixed. So it's not a political issue, it's an issue of you run your economy the way you want to run it, but this should not put the others at a comparative disadvantage, hence the importance of this competitive neutrality, whether on the Chinese domestic market or when others compete with Chinese businesses in international markets. On TPP, I very much agree that the TPP is the best in class for the moment. If you look at what is the most modern way to address both what I called protectionism and precautionism, including all these trade and environment, trade and health, trade and safety, trade and so on, the TPP is the best benchmark on the market. The paradox being that it's a creation of the US. The whole software of the Trans-Pacific Partnership is a US software that coincides with the way the US see the world, with the way the EU see manufacturing, services, intellectual property. It's incredibly US-minded. And Australia and New Zealand and Japan and others have accepted that. And the paradox is that this incredibly US-minded, very good agreement, the US are not part of it. That's a sort of mystery of history, which historians will probably comment 50 or 60 years from now. I think that the way forward is probably that you should do with TPP what we are doing with WTO, i.e. move away from the single undertaking and accept that TPP is with bits and pieces, and that some of these bits and pieces can be joined either by the US or by China or by UK. Why not? And I think this is the pragmatic way to go. But it remains that it is a lead agreement, especially, by the way, if you compare it to RCEP. RCEP is very much a sort of old-style agreement that deals mostly with manufacturers, tariffs, and quantitative restrictions. It's a large agreement, and hence its importance, but it's much shallower in terms of discipline on how you run your economy in order to benefit from open trade than the TPP. As far as the EU-China investment agreement, I remember what was signed at the end of last year between US and China was not a trade agreement. It was an investment agreement that basically allowed the EU to catch up on what the US had gotten from China in terms of openness for investing in China. You're absolutely right. For the moment, this will not be ratified by the European Parliament because of sanctions and retaliations on sanctions about Uyghurs, Hong Kong, and so on. Again, on this, let's be pragmatic. Nothing prevents both China and the EU to effectively implement this agreement without this agreement being ratified. If we are serious about the fact that there are benefits on both sides, it will not be ratified, so it will not be legally binding as a treaty should be legally binding, but nothing prevents both sides to move in reality towards the content of this agreement. And this, I think, this is, the way to go. On your last question about the Paris Peace Forum, Henry, the Paris Peace Forum, of course, is not a trade forum, and it's probably not fit to be a trade forum because, the Paris Peace Forum is about getting things done. It's about getting projects done. It's about moving global cooperation into new areas by new stakeholders, whereas a multilateral trading system is still something that has to do a lot with regulation. And the Paris Peace Forum is about cooperation between non-state driven, non-sovereign partners like NGOs, like big businesses, like big academic institutions, like big cities, whereas trade is still regulated by sovereigns. So this is not where we have, as a Paris Peace Forum, a big comparative advantage, but what we can do is mix like what we do in order to try and address this looming, if not already there, vaccine apartheid between North and South on this planet, which I personally believe is a dramatic development that will slow the exit of this economic crisis stemming from a sanitary crisis for 1 or 2 more years, which I believe is a dramatic development. And what we are trying together, as you said, Henry, with the World Bank, with the IMF, who's taking a leading role in trying to address this issue of a better North-South production and distribution of vaccines, including, of course, with WTO and WHO. This sort of four people, David Malpass, Kristalina Georgieva, Ngozi, and Dr. Tedros, are the ones we are trying within the Paris Peace Forum to push to cooperate, including in trying to get from the next G20 commitments about more production and more distribution of existing non-use vaccines, which I believe is really, really, really a major issue, which we have to address extremely rapidly, short of which I believe a sort of new North-South fracture will divide this world, and we will see the consequences of that in major negotiations like the one who are being prepared for Glasgow on climate change, for instance. So I think this is a big, big, big problem. Not that our trade issues are not important, but for the moment, there is something more important, which is this vaccine production and distribution, which is a major economic issue. Over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Pascal. Yes, great. I really congratulate you on the leadership of the Paris Peace Forum, which you have such a great rally power, and of course with WHO, WTO, and World Bank, IMF. You already had quite a few webinars I attended, but I think maybe you could add AIB in the future to other infrastructure part of that, because infrastructure would be a new area that I see President Biden is paying a lot of attention, EU is paying attention, China is really also doing a lot of work. So that could be one of the things. I don't know if a WTO or maybe other, World Bank can, AIB can work together. But I agree with you that the TPP. I mean, I'm quite pleased to see both Wendy and Pascal has actually have a high credit for TPP as a higher standards of the future trade. Upper trade, high standard trade for the global trade in future, and maybe set a good example for the WTO reform. So even we put part of a piece of that, that'd be great. So I'm glad that CCG also been promoting China joint TPP, because I feel that maybe it's like a mini WTO we can join, because since China joined WTO, China abolished thousands or tens of thousands of outdated rules and regulations that made China, going forward. So we need some new target to hope to aim for, so that TPP could be a good high standard for our reform as well. Now I won't have a last round of my talk. We collect some questions from our experts and media as well. But before we do that, I would like to pose another question to Wendy, is that on the Sino-US trade relation. You know that, of course, you've been waiting this. We've been also talking in the 2018, 2019 when on the hike of U.S.-China trade war going on, and then of course President Trump has put such a large tariff on China. I mean, still 300 some billion there not lifted. So what do you think about the phase one, and then if there's a phase two, or is there a near future that we can really get our talks to lift those trade sanctions? Because I see the USTR, Kathleen Tai has made a phone call with Vice Premier Liu He, and the Minister of Trade also has Commerce has a phone call as well. So what do you think about I see there's an Alaska meeting between the top diplomats, the Tianjin meeting last week between diplomats. What about we have a trade minister meeting or commerce minister meeting or USTR meeting to solve these trade sanction issues that, as you also mentioned, particularly on the medical, some urgent supply issues. We shouldn't leave levy tax on both sides. We should really support on that, and maybe have some new incentive for the WTO minister meetings for that. What do you think? And all your comments about Sino-US trade relation. Wendy, please.
I think that could be subject to its own webinar, but just a few thoughts here. It's interesting. During the Trump administration, I think U.S.-China trade friction kind of, was front and center in our overall relationship. And in the Biden administration, trade is part of a whole host of issues that are being reviewed internally. So the Biden administration is still undertaking its review. We don't know where they're going to come out on tariffs and sanctions and phase one agreement and the phase two issues. So we'll have to see how that transpires. My personal view, though, is we should find a way to, again, maybe with respect to tariffs, to find some baby steps we could take, meaning just, as you mentioned, I think the United States now, we have over $300 billion worth of tariffs in place against Chinese imports. China has $110 billion worth of tariffs imposed on U.S. imports. So I think there is room for kind of small steps to be taken, and then we can see, does that work, and maybe then build on it over time. But I think we need to be realistic and pragmatic. Both sides have their own domestic audiences that we're responding to. This would happen, let's be honest, not in a vacuum, but in the context of just broader U.S.-Sino frictions and tensions. So that would be number one on the tariffs. With respect to phase one implementation, my personal view is, under the circumstances, China's doing a pretty good job in implementing the rules part of the agreement. When it comes to purchases, yeah, they're falling short, but with respect to agriculture purchases, they're probably doing, Beijing's doing the best in meeting those targets. Those detailed targets will expire at the end of this year, but the agreement itself stays in place until either side notifies the other it wants to exit. But what will be critical is when we look at these so-called phase two issues, which were never addressed, the phase two negotiations never started. I think the question is how best to address those issues. And some of them, particularly the issue of subsidies and related kind of non-market economy practices, I think the best venue, if the WTO really worked well to address these, would be the WTO. We're not going to, address these issues, in my view, bilaterally successfully, and it'd be important to bring in other countries. So I would hope that China would be positive about addressing these issues in negotiations in the WTO. If the Chinese delegations in Geneva continue to refuse to open the door to negotiations in these areas, the US and other countries are going to have no choice then but to look at alternatives. And the alternatives, I think, will be what I would call defensive measures, strengthening their own toolbox. We've already seen the EU do this recently on subsidies and competition policy. There's legislation in the United States to strengthen and expand our countervailing duty legislation. And so I think that is going to be the response if the WTO can't move forward and tackle some of these difficult issues.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you. I think that that's something I think we all need to talk, and I'm glad to see that the phase one probably went relatively well, and also that I totally agree with you. We should start lifting some of those tariffs imposed on each other, and then we can really move from there and maybe even remove most of it or even completely. So we need to talk. We need to start somewhere. Absolutely. Now, Pascal, I mean, you are in the EU. You're in the center. You're in Paris. You have been in all those issues. I noticed that OECD, lately proposed there's a global corporate minimum tax, and then that has actually proposed by G7, and then proposed by G20, and then 130 countries. Goes along with it. In principle, China is agreed to on that, and so that is one issue. And also about this digital tax. The EU used to asking for those big tech companies. So what about those issues? I don't know if you're still on top of those issues. Maybe you can share on that of the EU perspective on that as well.
I think these are the area of global taxation for multinational companies is one of the very rare good news we've had for the last years in terms of international cooperation, which, generally speaking, has been pretty immobile. There are very, very few issues where we can see progress in international cooperation. This is one, and we owe it mostly to the Biden administration. These issues about avoiding multinational corporations to practice what diplomats kindly define as excessive tax harmonization, and I love this way they have of calling this excessive tax optimization. I think this is an area where we've had progress. We owe it mostly to the Biden administration, and this is good news. And it simply stems from the fact that the importance and the growth of these multinational companies, including in the digital sector, where they are making hundreds and hundreds of billions of profit without paying taxes, is something that has become unsustainable for political reasons everywhere. But to be frank, Henry, this is an exception. And we need much more than that, especially in trying to move out of this COVID crisis. We need much more than that to re-dynamize international cooperation. I think the G20 is the available space to do that, not that it is a full-fledged institution, not that the G20 members have the legitimacy to speak for the rest of the world, but this is the place where I think we should focus our minds, including, by the way, and on this I very much agree, to translate into general terms what Wendy has just said about fixing the US-China trade frictions and tariffs. I think the most urgent thing is to try and devise for the next Italian G20, apart from what I've said on vaccines, a few low-hanging fruit that would not be too difficult to address and that would signal a relaunch of international negotiations and cooperation on trade. I think what we need for the moment is to defreeze this US-China EU triangle in order to move things forward. And I agree with Wendy that the most obvious area to do that, which is not a major trade problem, but which has become a symbol of whether the WTO can decide and move forward, is these fisheries subsidies, which is a low-hanging, if not fruit, fish, at least fruit, which I think we really should focus on. And on this, to be frank, we need China to engage. China, fishing-wise, is not anymore a developing country. I know that for reasons and principle, China will not recognize this. And this is not about China recognizing a big principle. It's about China accepting to join a system of disciplines, which I think is really needed to preserve the fish resources for the future. And it's as much an environment as a trade problem. So if China still has trade problems with the West, please, China, look at this with environmental glasses.
Okay, thank you, Pascal. I think I think that you talk about China as a developing country. China actually, the per capita wise, still pretty relatively low compared with all the developing countries, or developed countries. But as a matter of fact, China, even though they are, because they are in line with many developing countries, they didn't really enjoy the developing country benefit in terms of the WTO. So they have foregone a lot of that benefit already. So I think that is something that maybe term-wise, we can think about that. But I don't think it was really a substantive issue there probably. But anyway, we are coming to the final online question part. We're going to conclude probably soon. But as a matter of fact, my staff told me we have about almost 400,000 viewers watching us online, and those in China and outside. And so you're really getting a lot of attention. I have some online question collected. Actually, I have a question from Professor Tu Xinquan. He's a CCG non-resident senior fellow, and he's the Dean and Professor of China Institute for WT Studies at the University of International Business and Economics. He has a question. He said, we expect the Biden administration, which pays more attention to the multilateral system, would support the restoration of the operation of the WTO appellate body. However, a little difference has been seen in the attitudes of the Biden administration compared with the Trump era. Is the U.S. going to completely abolish the appellate body, or is it using as a leverage to obtain specific policy objectives such as more free use of anti-dumping and countervailing rules? So he has another question related with the fishery discussions. He said, hopes are high on negotiating on the fishery subjects at the 12th WTO Ministerial Conference. But that said, the U.S. recently proposed to add the issue of forced labor in the negotiations. Does this signal U.S. intention of making more difficult of the success negotiation, or use it as a concession to obtain concession from other countries? So that's from Professor Tu. But I also have some question from the media, like from the China Daily. What is the biggest challenge for international trade in the context of COVID-19? How should we, tackle that? And also from CPPCC Daily, China's Political Consultative Conference Daily. Recently, the executive meeting of the State Council of China has decided to further deepen the reform of the cross-border trade facilitation and improve the business environment at ports. Those measures mainly included 27 specific content in the 5 aspects. So would this be positive signs of China actually moving forwards to the multilateral system? One thing has been highlighted, that is we need to optimize the authorized economic operator system and provide more facilitation measures for authorized enterprise. How to evaluate this, what this means to further strengthen hand. Anyway, maybe this is too concrete question, but then there's another one from South China Morning Post. I think similar to what Professor Tu was saying. The fishery subsidy issue is currently the sole active area of the multilateral negotiation at the WTO. How possible do you expect that a WTO fishery pact can be reached by the end of the year? What are the stumbling blocks and how to deal with them? Whether the U.S.-China tension remains a key factor for the talks. So I think we probably have last few questions for you to see if you want to address any of them, and maybe we'll conclude after that. So maybe Wendy, you want to go first?
Sure. A lot of questions. So let me respond to a few. First, with respect to the appellate body, I think you need to give the administration more time here. They're clearly reviewing, the issues related to dispute settlement in the WTO. I would also note that the appellate body issue was an issue of concern even before President Trump took office. And I would just echo what Pascal Lamy said a little while ago, that this is not just a US concern, that other countries are concerned with the operation and the overreach of the appellate body. So I think we need to give the administration more time. My hope is that with time, they will put concrete ideas on the table on how their concerns can be addressed, as opposed to what officials in the Trump administration did, was just to kind of sit on the sidelines and kind of complain about the system. So again, let's give it more time. With respect to trade and COVID, one issue we have not covered, and I just want to put it on the table, is the whole issue of export restrictions really needs to be looked at. The WTO rightly allows for export restrictions to be imposed, but there are certain principles, including these measures should be temporary and they should be transparent. And if you look at the recent study coming out of St. Gallen University, they closely catalog all the restrictions that are put on medical related goods, medicines, as well as food. And I think they noted like hundreds of measures now have been in place for over 1 year. So I think that is an area where more discussion and kind of more focus, more transparency should be put on to make sure once these restrictions are put in place, that they don't remain in place forever. Finally, on the fisheries negotiations, I'm hopeful that that will be a concrete outcome of the ministerial meeting in November. But this is not a given. There's a lot of work still to be done. While a lot of progress has been made, there are still some potential stumbling blocks. And those include exceptions that developing countries, including China, want to take from the obligations. And so the WTO is in a summer break now. They'll have 3 months to continue negotiations in this area. And I'm hopeful, given the high stakes of reaching an agreement here, that parties will come together and find not just a solution, but a meaningful solution that really contributes to what is a growing global problem.
Okay, thank you. Pascal, please, your final comment.
Yeah, on international trade and COVID-19, as I said previously, I don't think it's a major trade problem, nor do I believe that the solution to producing more vaccines and distributing them better is a trade issue, but for a limited aspect, which is whether and how you can oil the compulsory licensing system that already provides waivers for intellectual property in case of health emergency. So it's not a major trade issue, but there is an issue there that needs to be considered. I do not agree that the main bottleneck to producing or distributing more vaccines lies there, although I believe that if there is a necessity to recourse more easily to the existing system of compulsory licensing, this should be looked at. On measures for trade facilitation, imports or otherwise, I think China is right. There still remains, although we have a trade facilitation agreement since the end of 2013, and I remember that because it took us 4 years to cook it in the WTO at the time, whereas there are obvious huge potential for trade facilitation in digitalization of trade procedures, imports, export certificates, import licensing, proof of origin. The digital technology can help a lot. There still is a handicap for notably small businesses. And I think in doing what China does in easing its port handling procedures, it's doing exactly right. And finally, on fish subsidies, I again totally agree with Wendy. The answer to the question which was raised, which is what stands on the way to an agreement, I think the simple answer is the following. We need stronger disciplines that prevent subsidies that lead to overfishing, but we need to preserve small artisanal coastal fishing operations. That's the key. Now, in simple words, we need disciplines for everybody, but for small fishing boats, artisanal, not industrial, coastal, not icy, small, not big boats. Now, how small is small remains to be negotiated, but I think if there is a political willingness to do an agreement, how small is something which trade negotiators can fix rather easily. So that's my view. That's where the problem lies. And this is where, in my view, the solution lies. There is a solution in defining how small is small. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Pascal. I think we almost come to the end of our webinar, a special webinar series for the 7th Center for China and Globalization Forum. I really appreciate this discussion tonight. I think it's very stimulating, very constructive, and also very full of a lot of ideas and suggestions. And also, I think that we have covered many issues: WTO reform, COVID-19, the future multilateralism, even concrete as a TPP, a fishery subsidy, and Paris Peace Forum. Of course, we have so many issues. But I think this is really great. I mean, this is an open dialogue we have. It's really a frank discussion, and also it's very good to stimulating more thoughts. I really appreciate that. We have come to some kind of consensus that maybe we should really lift some of those tariffs, even from very minimum. But I'm very grateful that, of course, also we had this we should have a China joint WTO is a good thing. I mean, at least we have a consensus. Of course, we still need to make progress. We need to still to make reform. But China join the WTO, not only good for China but also for the world. I think that is another consensus we have. But also, finally, I really appreciate. All three of us mentioned about U.S., EU, China. Let's have a trilateral summit of some kind. Be on the trade. I mean, honestly, that probably even on COVID-19 fighting as well. It would be a really great idea to do that. I really hope that we have offered policymakers some interesting alternatives as well. So once again, I want to thank Ms. Wendy Cutler, Vice President of Asia Society Policy Institute. But also former acting USTR and chief negotiator of TPP, and also to Mr. Pascal Lamy, the president of Paris Peace Forum, but also the former WTO Director General for one of the longest serving DJ, and also former European Commissioner for Trade as well. So, and also to our viewers, I mean, we have almost 400,000 viewers online, and that's spectacular across China and the rest of the world. So once again, thank you all very much, and we hope to see you again sometime later. So thank you.